Hello everybody. We're going to talk about page 1 of your painting skills packet. Painting Studio is the first page. You are going to draw a picture in each of these 6 boxes and you're going to paint the picture with a different type of paint. You can draw whatever you like in your picture. It doesn't matter to me. Start with a pencil and just draw a simple picture. To show you an idea, a quick idea, I'm just going to draw a heart in each picture. You can draw something more complicated than this. All right, now I've drawn my picture. I'm going to set up my paint tray. When you set up your paint tray, you should have a tray with a water dish and a sponge. Water dish is to wash your brush, sponge is to dry your brush. You should have this certain type of paint that you're going to start with on your tray. And then I would suggest to have 3 different sizes of brushes: big, medium, and skinny. All right, my first box says Watercolor Cake. So these are watercolor cakes. They are called watercolor cakes because if you touch the paint, it's not wet until you add water to it, and they are little discs like little cakes. So to get this paint working, I have to take my brush and I have to dip in my water, and I've got to get the paint wet. So I'm not jamming my brush into the paint, I'm just tapping lightly to get the paint working. All right, I'm going to paint my heart in using red, so I'm just going to tap in red. Get a little bit of paint on my brush and paint in my shape. Watercolor paint is very liquidy. It's very see-through. It should not be thick like acrylic paint. When I want to switch colors, I have to wash and dry my brush, then get more water on my brush and swish in a new color. Dip, dip, dip until the paint starts working, and then paint with that new color. Now the thing about watercolor paint is it's so liquidy. It does dry pretty fast, but it is very liquidy. So if you have 2 colors that are wet still and they touch like this, they're going to start to bleed into each other and mix. So if you don't want that effect, then you probably would have to wait for an area to dry before you paint up against that area. So see, my red heart is kind of drying right now, and so it's not bleeding that much. All right, wash my brush off, and I'm going to switch to the next type of paint so I can put this watercolor tray away in the paint center. And I'm going to grab tempera cakes. So these are tempera cakes. These are just like watercolor paints, except it's tempera in a cake. So it's dry until I add water to it, just like watercolor paint. So if I dip my brush in my water and then swish in my color, I will get the paint working. Now it's not as fragile as watercolor paint, so I can kind of really dig my brush in there. It's okay. Get my color, and then I'm going to paint my picture. Tempera cake is like watercolor paint in that it is kind of liquidy and see-through, but it's not as see-through as watercolor paint is. It's a little bit more opaque, we call it. Opaque means not super see-through. All right, I'm going to use this paint to paint all the way in the background, finish my picture. Just like watercolor paint, if you have 2 colors that are still wet and they touch, they'll bleed. Not as much as watercolor paint bleeds though. All right, wash my brush, switch now to liquid watercolor. This is liquid watercolor. Be careful when you open this lid, because it's so liquidy that sometimes it can kind of jump up at you. So be really careful when you open this lid. All right, liquid watercolor is a really awesome type of watercolor because it has really nice bright colors. However, there's a couple rules different from watercolor cakes. First of all, you don't need to add water to them. They're already very watery. See how drippy the paint is? I love liquid watercolor because the colors are so bright, and you can get some really neat bright effects with these colors. Watercolor cakes are not as bright. They're a little bit more see-through, more like pastel-y colors. These are a bit more bright. So I'm just using one color, but right now I'm about to switch to a new color, so I have to really wash my brush off really good and dry it. I don't want to add any extra water to these. They're already very watery. And I don't want to mix up these colors. Keep them nice and clean. If you're not sure what the color is, some of these look a little dark and they're hard to tell, just test it on a scrap paper. Now these are very similar to watercolor cakes because they're very liquidy. So again, if you touch too wet areas, it will bleed, but they do dry pretty fast. So this area is already pretty dry. All right, I'm gonna wash my brush. I'm gonna carefully close the lid on this and put it away. And then I'm going to switch to acrylic. Now acrylic, you might wanna grab a mixing plate while you're using acrylic because you might wanna mix some new colors on your plate. You cannot mix these colors up. They need to stay fresh and clean how they are. So let me grab a mixing plate. In the paint center, you will find something that looks like this. It's a paint palette or a mixing plate, and you can use this to scoop colors into different areas. Wash my brush in between, and I can mix up my own unique colors. Just make sure you wash your brush in between. All right, now acrylic paint is not washable, so you have to be really careful with this paint. Wear an apron if you're worried about getting it on your clothes because it will not wash out of your clothes. This is a type of paint that is very thick, so you shouldn't really see your paper through it. Sometimes it takes a few layers, but it should be pretty thick and opaque, so not see-through or transparent. When you want to switch colors, you really need to wash your brush and scrub it on your sponge. This is super important. Scrub, 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 and get all that paint off so that we don't get any mixed up paint. I even like to test my brush on my hand, and if I still see color, I rinse and dry one more time. All right, that looks pretty good. And I'm just gonna use this color to paint the background. Notice how my paint is not going all the way to the shiny parts. It should go just on the tip of the bristles. I'm holding my brush like a pencil, so I have control over it. I'm not holding it all the way up here, like a pencil down by the tip, and I'm using the tippy toes of my brush to paint. So I ran out of paint there. I wanted to just get more. I just dipped the tip of my brush in my paint. All right, and I'm done with this box. Wash all that paint away, and now I'm gonna grab paint markers. Before I do though, I'm going to wipe this off with a wet wipe, put it back in the paint palette clean bin, and I'm going to put the lid on the acrylics and put those away. Okay, paint markers, you will find these in the paint center. You do not need water or paint brushes for these, you just need the marker itself. So just like regular markers, they're not washable, you can't wash them away. And just like a regular marker, it has a tip and the ink comes out of the tip. But unlike a regular marker, it has paint in it. So the trick of paint markers is the more you press the tip, the more paint is gonna come out. So I don't want to leave the tip pressed down for a long time because that means a lot of paint is going to start to glob out of the marker. So I'm not going to color this whole thing, it's going to take me a while, but you get the idea. If you see a tip that is white, these all look like they're ready to go, but if the tip is white, that means it's new, or if it's yellow, that means it's new. No paint has come to the tip yet. So to get the paint to come to the tip, you have to press the tip and the paint will start to glob out. Press it until you see the paint starting to come slowly out. Okay, all right, watercolor pencil and watercolor crayons are the last box. You will find these in a paint center in two different bins. These are watercolor crayons and these are watercolor pencils. Now, both of these work in a similar way. When you use watercolor crayons or pencils, you are basically coloring as if it's a regular crayon or pencil. And you're just coloring in an area. After you put a solid amount of color down, it's gonna look kind of like a drawing. But after you have put all that color down that you would like to put down, and you can even kind of put colors next to each other. We're gonna take our brush and get some water. So I'm gonna use my medium brush here, dip in my water. It should be fresh water, clean water. And I'm going to just smooth out this color. So when you add water to watercolor pencils or watercolor crayons, it will start to blend out the color, and it kind of turns the color into paint. So basically it's just smoothing out the color, and you can mix colors. So the water turns it into paint. All right, that is it for page 1. Put your name on it when you're done. Put it on the drying rack if it's still wet, and watch video number 2 for page 2.